sure, than our next speaker, Victoria Brittain, who has extensive experience in covering wars. She's a former associate editor of The Guardian and co-author with Moaz Beg of a book I'm sure many of you will have read from 2007, I think, Enemy Combatant. So, Victoria, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I hate to correct the chair, but I was never an associate editor of The Guardian. That was much, much too elevated for me.
I read that in The Guardian.
I was an associate foreign editor, which was kind of like being parked a bit to the side. Anyway, I just have to put that on the record. I'm glad you went back to the title. When I got this title, Serving the Military or the Public, Covering the War on Terror, I thought, well, it's not so much serving the military, I think, versus the public, as serving government and serving the intelligence services. I think the military are often quite small fry in these areas. And I started to think a bit about the first war I covered, which was Vietnam. And I was at the time incredibly young and gormless, and when I arrived, I thought I watched what everybody else did, which was they went to what were called the 5 o'clock follies, which were briefings by the South Vietnamese military, lots of medals here, with their American advisors, and they went to meetings in the American embassy, mostly, sometimes in the British embassy. Then, after I'd been there a very short time, I found I was being very publicly mocked as the person who's come to write soppy stories about orphans and refugees. And I thought, fine, okay, that's exactly what I am going to do. And I was blessed with the most incredible and wonderful interpreter, Mr. Locke, who's been immortalized by the great Mark Frankland, the Observer journalist, from whom I inherited Mr. Locke. So my reporting was going around on the back of Mr. Locke's tiny little motorbike, going to villages and staying in villages which were in the daytime belonging to the South Vietnamese and in the nighttime belonging to the Viet Cong. It was interviewing mothers who'd lost their kids. It was indeed going to lots of orphanages. And I felt very privately, because I was shy and nervous against all these big macho guys who were ready to laugh at me, that I had the feel of what is war, and that what I was saying was what ordinary people wanted to know about war, rather than about battalions moving from here to there and tremendous successes in some faraway bit of Vietnam that nobody had actually been to. And when I later spent a lot of time covering another war in Angola, I adopted the same kind of technique, but instead of Mr. Locke, I had the Angolan Women's Organization, who in the structure of a one-party state were actually rather powerful women. And they were able to take me to all sorts of places on the ground, where again I met the real experts in war, the people who are having it done to them. And similarly, when I've worked on Palestine, I've been a lot in camps in Lebanon, in Syria, in Gaza, and in the West Bank. And again, I feel that I was hearing from the experts about what's really happening. So when I started thinking about the war on terror, and obviously I was going to be very far away from it, I had the same instinct. And I didn't realize I was going to be able to do it from this country, but in fact it fell into my lap because I was asked to do the interviews for a verbatim play on Guantanamo, which meant interviewing the families, bewildered families as they were in 2003, whose sons, or in some cases husbands, had simply disappeared into Bagram or Guantanamo. And as Des said, from that I was asked by Moaz Beg to help him write his memoir of Guantanamo. In the course of that, I began to meet a lot of people who had really seen the sharp end of the war on terror, either because they had been in Guantanamo or their families had been in, somebody from their family had been in Guantanamo, or indeed in this country in Belmarsh and Long Lartin. And so I entered the world of control orders, secret evidence, Orwellian world of SIAC, which is the special, Special Immigration Appeals Commission, where there's this very, very curious arrangement where the person who is trying not to be deported is represented by a lawyer called a special advocate, who he can never speak to. And the special advocate can see the evidence against him, but cannot discuss it with his own lawyer, or indeed with him. And I began to write about these things. And what I began to learn from lawyers both here and in America was just how completely illegal and evil the war on terror has been. And it's very easy, we're 10 years down the road and we all want to forget it. I hope you won't forget it because my book is coming out next year. But people do want to forget it because we've been numbed into thinking that kind of torture is sort of normal and it's maybe you can have torture light, all these kind of things, which when I think back about how the Americans prevented us in Vietnam, the journalists in Vietnam, from ever finding out what the South Vietnamese did by way of torture in their prisons, although there were some heroic American journalists who did find it out. I realize we know so much now of what's happened, and we have not found a way of converting that knowledge into affecting anybody in power. And that, I think, is actually what this conference is kind of really all about. And I think it's true to say that with some extremely honourable exceptions, the Western media has done a poor job. But what has not done a poor job has been the alternative media. If you look on the web, you can find out all these things. There are tremendous reports done by all kinds of different academics and lawyers, more in America than here, which really expose what is the war on terror. And I want to just take a case of media and the war on terror from today. It concerns Abu Qatada. On the mirror.co this morning, I read this by Tony Parsons. I'm just going to read a little bit of it. Preacher of hate and slaughter, ambassador for Osama bin Laden in Europe. It costs £5 million a year to keep an eye on you. And this is the bit that had me almost gulp on my coffee. What sticks in the throat is that he won his legal battle to stay in Britain the day after Remembrance Sunday, when we remember those who fought and died for the freedom of generations not yet born. Now, if the security services and Mrs. May have garlands to give out, this journalist is surely going to be the recipient of that. It's hard to even imagine constructing such a sentence if you had done the minimum of homework on this case. And there have been some very good articles on Abu Qatada which point out that if he'd ever been charged with anything in this country, he would of course have been tried. The fact is that he hasn't. And yet everybody, the most obscure little member of parliament, and the not at all obscure mayor of London, and indeed Mrs. May, and indeed Mr. Cameron, who is now irritated by this case, they have all written as though this man is a terrific threat to us. The threat has been explained to them by the security services, which is why I wanted to turn around a little bit the title. I've only got half a minute by now, so I'm not going to say more about this, but I just want to say that I think the alternative media of every sort is an absolute boon to us. And with all the terrible threats that the media we have known and loved these many decades, in my case, under incredible threat, we have to be creative and we have to embrace the possibility of doing things completely differently so that we can hold people to account and tell the stories of what really happens in these wars to the people who are our public. Thank you very much. Well, I'll just very quickly say, in response to the first question, you may be aware of the principled resignations from Al Jazeera newsroom that took place because of the directions they were being asked to do. And I think that's great. And it would be something that one might like to see in other places. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And the second thing was I want to slightly take issue with Chris Nynam. When he says our side has won the battle of ideas, well, we have in this room. The problem is we haven't won it out there. And I think this is one of the things that perhaps you need to talk about in the afternoon in the workshops. You know, I've heard the colleague from the FT speak before, and I think it's fabulous that he manages to operate within a very hierarchical and constrained, but actually in many ways rather excellent paper, having very different ideas. And I wish that in more papers there were people who were as clear-sighted and as ready to challenge the hierarchy as he obviously is. And I think specifically within the BBC, this is obviously a very, very important thing that isn't happening. And when I talk to students, like when I was at Queen Mary's this week, you know, well, what can we do? And you know, my answer was, you know, become journalists. It's the greatest job in the world. It's really hard, but you can change things on an individual basis. If you're very well informed, you work very hard, you can change it. And just to link back to what I said at the beginning, we're in the new world of all these different kinds of media, and I'm not talking about Twitter and all that kind of thing, but I was just looking at the things that I write in all the time are different websites. They're the Institute of Race Relations, they're Cage Prisoners, they're various French magazines. I do Russia Today, Al Jazeera. Some of my articles get translated into Arabic and are in Al-Quds. You know, the world doesn't begin and end with Associated Newspapers and The Guardian. So that's just what I want to say to students in particular. Don't think that we've won, but don't think that we can't win.
Before Seamus